listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast by Dr. T. Michael W. Halcomb, Dr. Frederick J. Long, Dr. Mario Melendez, Dr. Jennifer Noonan, and J. M. Smith. Welcome and enjoy.
Hello and welcome back to Proof Text. I'm Dr. Mario, and this is a segment we like to call What's in the Name. The name that we're about to cover now is Micah, the prophet Micah. I've spent a lot of time translating the book of Micah and writing papers about Micah, doing presentations about Micah, because it is Micah who talks about justice, and it's a whole nother conversation to be had another day. So let's, however, consider Micah's name, his message, and then its implications upon we as Christian believers. So Micah's name, etymology first, is actually a contraction. Hebrew is what we like to call a synthetic language, meaning that words like to magnetize together when possible. It makes for learning Hebrew very difficult if you're not from a background of a synthetic language. It took me several times to learn Hebrew. Nevertheless, Micah's name is a contraction. It is Micah, who is like Yahweh. Literally, that is Micah's name. Who is like Yahweh? Micah's name is really fitting for his text and his time. Should the Lord permit, one day whenever I turn these little snippet videos into a book, we'll delve into this more deeply. But Micah is confronting the kings that were serving at that point in time, because the prophet is actually the highest ranked officer in a theocracy here on earth. And so he's confronting the kings that he served under. Micah's book talks about three kings that he served under. That'd be Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. What's interesting about his name and the poignancy to his time period is that Jotham and Hezekiah are both good kings. Ahaz is not. So Micah, like many of his contemporaries, was serving in Judah, the southern area of the divided kingdom. And there was a roller coaster worth of good and bad kings. Good king, revival, bad king, plummet to the bottom again. And so Micah, like many of the prophets, is serving under good king, bad king, good king, bad king, good king, bad king, going back and forth in that way. And what we really understand from his book is that none of these kings are as good or as like Yahweh. Because, well, they're swayed by their emotions, they're swayed by their desires, they're swayed by the politics of their day and time. So we see in Micah chapter 7, verse 18, Micah puts it this way: who is a God like you? Literally, that is Micah's name in the text. Micah, who is a God like you, who pardons iniquity and passes over the rebellious acts of the remnant of his possession. He does not retain his anger forever, because he delights in chesed. That covenantal faithfulness is what that word is there. Anytime I run into the word chesed in Hebrew text, I refuse to use English for it, because we don't have a good English word to carry over to give the veracity of that text. Anyway, so Micah, who is like God? The poignancy to his book is that none of these kings, even the good kings, say for instance Hezekiah, who was a wonderful king, led a great revival, not even Hezekiah is like Yahweh. We understand, if we go back to Deuteronomy, or we could go back to 1 Samuel, that Yahweh was supposed to be their king. And yet they have appointed men to be their king. And, well, even the good men fall short of God's glory. Therefore, we really see in Micah's text, who is like Yahweh? He has that whole conversation about justice and faithfulness and worship and all these other things in his text. And the reality of it is that many people were doing the justice of the kings, were worshiping the kings, and were doing other things of the sort to pledge allegiance to the kings. And as a result, they were being not like Yahweh, not fully perfect pictures. Again, man is created in the Tselem of God, in the image of God. And so even the best, like Hezekiah, falls short of who is like God, falls short of being God. When we jump to the New Testament implications, though, we see two ways that this really can come across. One, we see it as in the message of Christians, but two, we see it in the personage of Christ. And so I'd really like to kind of rest on the personage of Christ, because we see here who is like Yahweh. Jesus fulfills Micah's name in very profound ways. He fulfills Micah's name in showing uniqueness and divinity. So who is like God? Not Hezekiah. Jesus is. And in fact, I rather like if we were to grab the message, and we'll kind of banter back and forth right quick. If we grab the message of Micah's name and drag it to the New Testament, who is like Yahweh, it is also a perfect affront to say Herod. It is a perfect affront to say Caesar. It's a perfect affront to say Pontius Pilate. These other people who were given such lofty titles and divine names at times, they are nothing like God. And yet Jesus perfectly fulfills Micah's name. Who's like God? Jesus. He's divine. Jesus reconciles and shows himself to be with God, to be God in John 10, for instance, where he talks about I and the Father are one. We have this perfect relationship. We get this divine authority that he is God. He's not like God. He is God. Number two, we see Jesus is a representative of God. Unlike the failed kings of the Old Testament, even the good ones like Hezekiah, Jesus makes it quite clear in the New Testament, if you have seen me, you have seen the Father. No king could say that about Yahweh in the Old Testament, that if you saw me, you saw Yahweh. That doesn't work for Hezekiah. That doesn't work for Josiah, for instance. It doesn't work for any of the good revival kings, because still they're flawed men. But Jesus has it, Micah, if you've seen me, you've seen Yahweh. He's a representative of God's character, unlike the kings. Man, Herod was even Herod the Great, who did all of his good building proceeds and had taken the Roman money and built up the land of Israel, Palestine. His character was flawed. Jesus' character is not flawed. In fact, he's led like a lamb to the slaughter, says the New Testament. He doesn't curse people as he goes along the way. In fact, he blesses them from the cross and says, Father, forgive them. Man, who's like that? Who can do that other than God? I like whenever we go to Mark chapter 2, for instance. Mark chapter 2. Jesus sees this paralyzed man, walks over to him, and of course the Pharisees, Sadducees, and the disciples of Jesus are there, and he looks at this paralyzed man and he says, hey, your sins be forgiven, rise and walk. And the Pharisees are like, whoa, time out. Who is this that can forgive sins but God? Who is he that he talks like this? That's Mario's translation. Who is he that he talks like this? This is blasphemy. Only God can forgive sins, says the Pharisees. And that's exactly the point. Jesus is Yahweh, Micah. We talked about this before in Joshua, that Yahweh saves. Yeshua is actually Jesus' name. Yahweh saves. And now with paralleling Micah's name, Jesus is like Yahweh. He's not just like Yahweh. He is Yahweh. He's Yahweh in his character. He's Yahweh in his divinity and uniqueness. He's Yahweh in his action. He's Yahweh in his salvation and his love for mankind. The list goes on and on and on. And so what do we do with this as Christians? Well, one, we definitely cannot apply Micah to ourselves. Even the greatest saints among us, we could go say, for instance, Mother Teresa or others like that, depending upon your view of Mother Teresa. But regardless, the saints among us still fall very short of being Micah, who is like Yahweh. So instead, what we need to do is we need to have this message. And I hear in my mind the great sermon of Peter from Acts 2, that this man who you crucified, oh, he is the Messiah. He is the one of God. And so Micah's message should tell us that we should then turn and boldly proclaim Micah, Jesus. Who is like Yahweh? Jesus is like Yahweh. In fact, Jesus is Yahweh, and he will save. And that's our name for the week, is Micah. I hope you'll grab that, read back into the prophet's text, the understanding of his name, and I hope this will help you out in understanding that Jesus is like Yahweh. Even the great kings of old didn't come that close as Jesus does. I'll see you in the next video.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.